Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are. We're so excited to have you with us today for our second episode of Next Up. As you may recollect, what we do in these episodes is we bring together domain experts, industry thought leaders, and visionaries to talk about the impact of technology, regulations, policies, and other aspects on the property and casualty insurance industry. Our guest speaker today is Jonathan Zittrain, and super excited to have him here. I will introduce him in a quick second, but before that, let me hand over to Manju for some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Shivani. Thank you everybody for joining us online. Really appreciate it. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Whilst we're having this conversation, it'll be great if you could join the discourse online as well. So please do not hesitate to write your comments or your thoughts to things we are discussing online. And also, of course, to ask your questions. On that bit, we will be taking your questions and answering them at the end of the conversation here. So please do bear with us. We appreciate your patience. Uh, Shawnee, anything else before we kick things off?
No, let's do it. And so let me introduce our guest speaker for today, Jonathan Zittrain. And I'm going to have to read out his bio because he has such an impressive bio and it was hard for me to memorize everything. But Jonathan is the George Bemis Professor of International Law at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's a professor of computer science at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, director of the Harvard Law School Library, and co founder of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. His research interests span technology policy, the ethics and governance of artificial intelligence, new privacy frameworks, and more. He's an author, Forum Fellow of the World Economic Forum, trustee of the Internet Society, and member of the board of directors of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, amongst so many other distinguished honors. Such an impressive background, Jonathan. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me, Shivani and Manju. It's great to be here, and hello, everybody.
And I'm so excited. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion on a variety of topics and how they relate back to our industry. So, with that, Manju, why don't you go ahead and ask the first question?
Thank you, Shivani. So, Jonathan, the automotive industry is at the forefront of technology revolution in many ways. Cars are transforming from what they used to be metal cages on wheels to what they're progressing towards essentially as mobile phones on wheels, you could argue, right? They have their own operating system. There's an app landscape that's coming up. In fact, arguably even a UX UI piece. If you saw the Apple CarPlay announcements last month at the developer conference. As cars get smarter, more connected, perhaps more autonomous, there's a lots of implications for data privacy, the transmission of data. I can imagine that payment systems are embedded in the car. So if I'm going through a drive-through at McDonald's, I just press a button and things get sorted out, right? How do you see the regulatory framework that may needed to be put in place to drive the adoption of these smarter vehicles in the future?
Well, what a great question. And I can't help but think, as is often the case, totally understandably, that the stuff that is percolating up to the regulatory environment is stuff that is kind of already happening. It's like the fierce urgency of now. And that might be, if we're talking about autonomous vehicles, first and foremost, a bunch of safety standards, wanting to make sure that cars are held to the right standard. Do they just need to be better than the average driver? Do they need to be perfect? Somewhere better than the best driver, but less than perfect? And that all makes sense to be taking that up. And if it isn't formally, in the United States example, regulated sort of in a broad and rules-based way, then the tort system will fill in to see about how good these products are. But I think it's also worth looking ahead to what autonomous vehicles, for example, could really start to unleash. And I don't know how far ahead this is. I think actually having truly autonomous cars is a really challenging problem if they have to share the road with anybody other than other autonomous cars. If they could just be on their own test track and you made the interstates the test track, that would make life a lot easier for the autonomous cars. But I think the key is, first, not just to think of it as like a cool chauffeur that drives your car for you and you don't have to pay as much attention to the road if you don't want to. But I remember my colleague here, Clay Christensen, started thinking about, well, you know, if you don't have to even be looking at the road, maybe the entire interior of the car should be redesigned. So you could put a poker table in the middle and like have 4 seats each facing one another, or a bed or whatever. You're in a moving box that could actually be a kind of fun place to hang out. And that's certainly interesting. But my mind, you mentioned the regulatory framework, starts going in other directions. So for example, I think about what it could mean with a nicely connected and autonomous vehicle if the police issue a warrant for someone's arrest. And then we identify that they're in a particular car, autonomous vehicle. So, all right, push the button, transmit the warrant, the doors to the car lock themselves, and the car starts driving to the nearest police station as if it were dropping off a package, and waits for the police to come out and collect the person. And I don't know if it's going to drive adoption of the cars, but it could turn out to be a useful thing once people have them. And then I start thinking,
and it may prevent some of those high-speed chases on the highways.
That's right. Well, and thinking of high-speed chases, imagine being able to declare an onboard emergency in your car, at which point all the other autonomous vehicles part, like the Red Sea, and slow down, and your car zooms to the nearest hospital, where I imagine at some point you have to collect a voucher to prove you really had an emergency rather than just you were kind of in a hurry and wanted to press the turbo button. I think about if it were, consider this a free idea, a Facebook for Uber, which is to say, imagine instead of having to pay for a ride, you don't own your own car, but you would normally take an Uber to get somewhere or a Lyft or something. Imagine that you could take a sponsored ride. So it'll be free, but you'll go to a surprise intermediate destination like that McDonald's that you mentioned, Manju, and it's going to wait outside the drive-through window. And like, you know, you have an opportunity to order a Whopper or something, and you can go ahead. I guess that's a mixed message from McDonald's if they're serving Whoppers, but you get my idea that you could end up having an entirely new economic model for transportation when you've got all these variables in play about a highly connected car that can drive itself. Some of them are scary to me. Some of them are quite fascinating. One last example I can't help but share would be, imagine when Hurricane Harvey was about to hit Houston in 2015, and officials in the area decided not to declare an evacuation because they were worried that there'd be big traffic jams of people following the order and getting stuck, and then the hurricane would catch them on the highway. Well, with autonomous vehicles that could smart route themselves so they don't end up jamming up where they shouldn't, you could declare an evacuation and your smart car would come up to your front step and say, you have 20 minutes to load your baggage and your family in the car, and then I'm out of here, totally your call. And that could help with an evacuation. So these are things that really stand to change the locus of control, which kind of by necessity has been focused on the person right behind the steering wheel, and to put it in all sorts of other places, local officials, wherever it might be, the police issuing that warrant. And I think we have a lot of thinking to do. And as you might guess, this is not on the regulatory landscape at all yet. It would be a regulation of convenience once everybody had the cars and somebody had a eureka moment and said, gosh, we could do this.
So do you see this in a classic situation where the economy and the corporate sector and innovation overall gallops forward, and eventually the regulation will catch up as and when they catch up?
Well, that's been the classic Silicon Valley model, and something that traditionally I have found myself, with respect to innovation in the digital space on internet, quite happy about. The idea that, I guess to put it as kind of directly as possible, whatever isn't prohibited is permitted.
Right.
So, and if the law is silent, go for it. And, you know, you've seen some Silicon Valley companies, possibly including ones I have already mentioned, that were just like, even if it isn't permitted, go for it, and create a reality on the ground so compelling or irresistible that the law will then conform to match the thing. And it might be a number of taxi drivers not so happy about that mode of doing things. And whether that is suitable in each sub area, I think is a question really worth reflection upon. And there are some areas, including those of AI, where they really do bear great possibility for innovation, but there can be failure modes with enough societal implication that we desperately need a model by which to kind of collectively think it through. And by the we here, I don't know if that means regulators in the first instance, but a we greater than just the two people in a garage saying, I've got nothing to lose. Let's unleash this thing on the internet on Tuesday and see what the world looks like on Friday.
There's a lot of things you mentioned, so thank you, and we'll pick those up in subsequent questions. But Shivani, why don't you take over with the next question, please?
Yeah, I wanted to go back, Jonathan, to one of the things you mentioned around all the connected cars and, you know, in general, connected devices and IoT. And, you know, some studies say there's over 46 billion connected devices today, of which, you know, more than 16 billion are active. I'm curious to know, you know, as you think about all these connected vehicles, and not just the connected cars themselves generating the data, but, you know, as people have their mobile devices and the devices themselves can generate data. We saw the Apple announcement at the developer conference. Google and the Android systems have been, you know, doing crash detection for a while through the mobile devices. Today, your car can tell you when a crash happens and potentially summon help. Tomorrow, there could be even more functions and capabilities that are offered. I'm curious to know your thoughts, Jonathan, as you see the increase of IoT devices, as you see computing move to the edge. What's your thought on where is all this going and what's going to be available for us in the next 3 to 5 years specifically? And maybe if we also tie it back to insurance.
Yes. So question that kind of has the answer or the premise of like everything everywhere all at once. And is that good, bad? What does it mean for us? And I agree that we are fitfully moving in the direction of so many connected things. It's funny when you talk about how many things are connected, just to reflect on part of how decentralized the internet is, that we kind of have to like sample the water with a ladle and then extrapolate to know how many things are connected. If this were all like one big, you know, AT&T or Verizon network, they know exactly how many things are connected at any given instant. And on the internet, it's like, there's a bunch of stuff. It's all IP addresses. And funny also to think there was a time when we thought in Internet Protocol version 4 that we'd have enough IP addresses forever. It was also the era in which MIT was accorded more reserved IP addresses than all of China. And we've been, as you probably know, going to IP version 6, which at last has more IP addresses than there are stars in the known universe, which is a very impressive statistic until you realize that there's an infinite number of numbers. Can't you just add one whenever you need one? And that was the great insight of IP version 6. So having this idea that every girder in a building could be a sensor, have one embedded in it, and know if it's been subjected to stress in an era of climate change when there's a lot more events that are outside of the 500-year expectation band or whatever it might be that insurance companies think about and for which the building was designed. You can think of all sorts of, I think, great and salutary uses of collective emergent use of data from those sensors that, in my girder example, that sensor was embedded there for exactly that purpose. In your iPhone example, somebody got the iPhone for whatever reason. They wanted to call somebody or they wanted to text. And then it turns out it comes along with all these sensors that could generate telemetry that could be enormously helpful, whether for that individual to detect a crash or collectively so that there is a bird's eye view to whomever is in a position to view all that data. and say something like, Cleveland is looking restless tonight. If I compare the movement of phones in Cleveland, and I've got a little bit of insight into totally anonymous and aggregated data, so no privacy issue, of everybody's Oura rings and Fitbits, and like, there's something up in Cleveland. Is there a sense of group privacy around that, or should we all be entitled to that? Oh gosh, it's the World Series, that's why Cleveland is upset, or whatever it might be. It does open up tons of possibilities. I would not be, in the vehicle space in particular, I think it's worth noting that in the most immediate term, I think because of supply chain issues and the deficit of new cars, trace it back to a chip shortage, all sorts of things, the rate of adding new connected cars into fleets has actually slowed recently. So we were kind of right on the brink maybe of a state change, and that's been delayed a little bit. You see connectivity happening primarily through cell phones or dash cam devices, not built-in technology. And in some ways, that's forestalling for just a little while longer another question latent in your question, which is how to think about interoperability. If we see any virtue in both having a collective view on something, properly regulated and circumscribed to who gets to access that and share it and to what uses that would be put, and if we see a virtue in allowing people to have a Hyundai for one life phase and then move to a Ford F-150 for the next, and then onward to a smart car or whatever it is, a Rivian, you don't want them to have to be like, oh darn, I was in the blah-blah-blah family of smart devices and I got to keep it all within the family. And that's a real problem, because it's just too much to expect in a market sense of consumers at the time they buy the first thing that inducts them into, the Corleones of the IoT, that they're in forever. There's no leaving. That would be a real problem. Sorry.
I think that's an excellent point, is that interoperability, because you're right, you get that first device and then everything else connects in. So, let's say you're on an Alexa system, Amazon Alexa versus a Google, you're kind of in that channel, and everything you do ends up being in that channel versus being able to mix and match and plug and play. And I was thinking about that comment you made about the sensor in the girder. And, recently I live in Northern California. We had the earthquake. And, you could imagine having a sensor or IoT device in the home that allows you to understand what was the impact of that earthquake on your home and the foundation, and how does that then impact into translation into the insurance side. As we think about the connected vehicles and the connected cars, there was a lot of telematics data that was being collected, originally used largely for underwriting and policy purposes. But more and more, we're starting to see that feed into the crash detection and claims resolution. Not just how do you provide support, but also how do you accelerate the whole claims resolution cycle as well, because you have a lot of good data that can help you inform that.
Shivani, actually, sorry, Jonathan, just one thing to add. At the insurance, there's a big annual trade show. It's called InsurTech Connect, happens in September in Vegas. So this year they had, when I was there, saw a handful, maybe half a dozen or dozen odd companies that were all building management systems integrated into IoT devices. Essentially what you said, the chip on the girder. And the whole idea was connecting back to what Shivani mentioned, that, hey, something is happening in the building, temperatures are high, whatever, and there's water going up, mold detected, and therefore at some point in the future, maybe not too far out, the claim is being filed and all the other rest of the activity is happening on its own.
Yeah, and in some ways I could see finding it advantageous to just more data is always better, and feeling like you've got a better bead on what's going on, and particularly for casualty in the insurance sense events where you have an earthquake or something that's going to affect a lot of people simultaneously, possibly in the same region, to have a sense so you can triage and know, both for public safety purposes and for remediation purposes, What are the things that can wait a couple days or a week? What are the things that need an immediate intervention? Even to be able to telegraph back to the folks in the apartment building or in the house what's going on. This is a wonderful question even of the division of responsibility between public and private. Is this a governmental function, which we think of the public safety function, you know, the emergency services and such as being, or is this the kind of thing where you could see a consortial approach where a bunch of entities that have the telemetry could come together for the purpose of intervening during natural disasters, again, for which we might have reason to think there's going to be more of them over time than fewer, and model how to be able to respond in ways that right now is still in an individualistic, or, you know, when do we summon the Red Cross to set up a tent here kind of way. And I think in that sense, it carries a lot of hope and possibility. And I would love to see something like that modeled, and possibly not waiting for a government to do it. If that consortium can be in a position to say, here's what we're going to do with the data, here's what we aren't going to do with the data. But it's much harder for individuals to plan for that extra rainy day when it's not raining. And so to have structural incentives for others to help them do it and to be ready to be there for them when that extra rainy day arrives, that seems like a pretty noble calling.
I want to pick up this thing where, you know, you mentioned about data, and, you know, AI is clearly the tip of the spear now. Almost every innovation that's happening is using AI in some way, shape, or form. Not only is it everywhere, the implications on end consumer or population segments is fairly profound. Whether your mortgage is being denied or, you know, your cancer is being detected, who knows? There's all kinds of wide swath it cuts. If you're a company, an enterprise, profit making, and you're trying to do all this stuff, and you want to innovate purposely or purposefully, but you also got to be mindful of where this regulatory, you know, field is headed. It's not the hammer coming down on you, but almost like, how do I make sure that what I'm doing today will continue to get me in the future without getting me in trouble with any potential, you know, regulation that comes down the line? Just as an analog, the European Union's GDPR law in 2018 was pretty landmark. It subsequently got adopted by a lot of other countries, and California, for example, was an early analog of that. Do you see a similar situation happening where, for our own algorithmic world that we now are trending towards or almost living in, we will need a similar regulatory regime to help people frame this? Because then, you know, I cannot go there. If I do go here, I need to take care of these 5 things, need to spell things out. Where do you see this playing out?
Well, it reminds me of a way I've been summarizing sort of governance in the digital space lately, which is we just only have 2 problems. The first is we don't know what we want. And the second is we don't trust anybody to give it to us. If we could just solve those 2 problems, we'd be in great shape. And the we don't know what we want part of things is a little bit different from the GDPR and the CCCPA kind of frameworks, because with privacy, I actually think for a good 15 or 20 years, there has been pretty good consensus among some of the disinterested parties and privacy advocates about what they want. You know, there's the argument around the margins, but it has to do with vindicating personal choice around the use of sensitive data or non-sensitive data around which sensitive inferences can be made. It has to do with not having people be exploited through so-called dark patterns or other things that extract consent from them, but they don't really know what they're signing up for. The kinds of things have a classic consumer protection ring to it that the biggest trouble over the past while in making progress there has been just about persuading regulators that this is worth their time and that this is a constituency worth paying attention to versus the others. And you also have with privacy, kind of at least a sense of the basic unit of information privacy until recently has just been data, datum about somebody.
Right.
when we start talking about AI and machine learning, we don't know what we want. We have clear examples of terrible failures or of things that have been, maybe the polite way to say it is, so innovative that the world just wasn't ready for it yet. I think of the UK insurance company, auto insurance, that did a little bit of so-called supervised learning, machine learning thing, where they had a bunch of data about car accidents and who was in them, possibly even who was accorded responsibility for having caused them. And they had Facebook accounts for those folks that they could train up as a data set. And they went ahead and trained it up. And it seems that this company had the idea that, if you wrote in short, concrete sentences and you used lists and you arranged to meet friends at a set time and place rather than just tonight, you were probably a safe driver. Now, first of all, it could be wrong, at which point, if I have hooked up my Facebook account for a potential discount with the insurance company, and who knew that because I use short sentences, even though I'm very careful, I'm in trouble, that's not great, because I, as the customer, don't even know the rules I'm supposed to play by. It's different from, like, I've got something in my car that I agreed to that, like, so long as I don't speed terribly, I'm getting discounts. But there's also the issue of just like, well, what if it gets it right? What does that even say about the use of this and how much I now start watching my own Facebook use because I'm realizing that it could affect my insurance rates if I too hastily advertise this event on Facebook using short sentences and I say tonight. And so that's the kind of thing that means everybody acting rationally and, for a company, generally speaking, profit maximizingly, for better or worse, everybody doing that could still lead us together into places that nobody really wants to be. And that's the kind of thing where you're like, great, we need some industry standards. Potentially we need wise regulation, but we're still trying to figure out, well, what's the unit of AI? And I could just give you quickly a first cut at it, for which if we come back and have this conversation in 5 or 10 years, I'm going to have a lot of stern words for myself about how wrong I am. But I would include in this data and data sets. That is the unit that machine learning models inhale and get trained upon, either all at once and then they are released and they don't alter in their behavior after, or so-called online learning means somehow they're getting data feedback after they are put into use, possibly through their use, which means they will evolve in the wild in ways that even the people that built the data set can't expect. And we are still at a really rudimentary time. So especially for businesses on the demand side who aren't in the business of building AI systems to sell to others, but potentially considering acquiring or rolling their own for use in a substantive business of their own, figuring out what is my data set that I am trying to cultivate or borrow. And often these data sets are passed around like Christmas fruitcakes. I think of if you are trying to do some kind of smart email program, one of the most common data sets of emails to train it up on is the Enron email data set released by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because they, as part of their $63 billion bankruptcy and the associated fraud investigations, got all of Enron's emails and then released them to the public. It's like the idea that you would train up an email system on that company's email is, ludicrous. It's a great example. So anyway, data is one, models and the PhDs behind them is the next, and compute power is the third. But back to you, Manju.
Now, I'm just thinking this Enron thing triggered a thought that, the whole issue of ethics comes in very quickly. Because if everybody is using the same Enron emails to train your email algorithms or what have you, once that flawed thinking, for lack of a better word, is embedded in that model, that is then suddenly replicated across hundreds of other places where that same bias has crept into the thinking.
Yes.
You probably heard about that credit card company that Goldman Sachs flagged. It was pretty recent, I think 6-8 months ago, where they were with the same level of qualification. Males were getting a far higher credit limit assigned to them than corresponding female applicants. Now, you could argue it's not the end of the world, but if far more critical use cases are being handled by AI, this could have far-reaching human implications. So the question was, where does ethics come into this whole thing? And again, ethics is such a slippery one to define.
Yes.
And if you're a company who, as you mentioned earlier, is in the business of consuming a certain model as opposed to building it particularly,
Yes.
they probably wouldn't even know what's in the model and if it passed certain ethical checks and guidelines.
Yes. Sometimes you only, by this telling, really become aware of the problems after you've gone into prime time, released this into the wild, and then through a measure of disparate outcomes, you realize you've touched a third rail. Like you've discriminated against sensitive categories of people. And now what? I mean, so I agree. There's lots of issues here, and of course, stories of emergent bias from these systems, often which don't need a data set as clearly, iffy as the Enron one to generate these kinds of outcomes. There's only recently emerging some practices by which you can try to tiger team your model, the data within it, try to clearly label the data so you know exactly what's going in. So if it's garbage out. And even if you're simply making more efficient and replicating simply discrimination already out there that is reflected in the model data you collected, you might have a chance to try to correct for that before you go live. Now, you asked the question of okay, ethically, how might this be handled? Some of the most direct approaches from some of the companies that think about this stuff is, again, I think understandably kind of top down. It's like, well, let's have an ethics committee. Let's have some central node through which we run everything. It'll be like the kidneys of the company to try to cleanse or detect and cleanse out impurities and whatever's going on. And that might be a worthy thing. I think there needs to be a counterpart to that, precisely because of your point about it's not like the CFO is going to know how this was trained. I sometimes think of AI as like asbestos. It's wholesale and not retail. It gets embedded in a bunch of infrastructure. Only later do you realize you have a problem, at which point you don't even have an inventory of where it was installed. That's a problem. And that's why I think the counterpart to those top-down approaches is to really invite and incentivize the data scientists, the engineers. If it's an outside vendor, you got to figure out how to incentivize that outside vendor to flag these issues, to really sensitize them to it at the outset. Because right now, nobody owns detecting and dealing with this category of problems. So there was somebody who was like, I've got some emails, they're Enron, let's put those in. Somebody in that workshop might have, if invited, had to think about it and
Jonathan, that's really interesting. And that's, we're talking about ethics and the intention, right? Where you're intentionally wanting to do the right thing and you put the processes in place to be able to do that and be ethical. How do you, there's also, if you think about the misintentions, right? If you think about people that are coming in with a active mindset of fraud or deep fakes, or, there could be fraud from a photo perspective. There could be fraud from actors. There could be fraud in network rings, et cetera. And in fact, in our industry itself, we know that there's a significant cost to fraud, which actually ends up resulting in individual premiums going up almost $400 to $700 per year. So, as you think about that, we talked about the intentionality of trying to do the right thing, but what do you think about the intentionality of doing the wrong thing, or, trying to be fraudulent or malicious in some ways? Like, how important is trust, and how do you prevent against some of those aspects?
Well, I think you're really helpfully kind of pointing to two pretty distinct threat models to deal with. One threat model is the bad actor that is somehow ready to take a few risks to try to get away with something. And that can proliferate if there is a sense the system is a little bit of a sieve and there's a way to, it's not worth the company to probably double check this. I'm just going to, fudge it kind of thing. Yeah. And I don't know if deepfakes, for example, represent a huge state change in that. It may be that the same people that were forging receipts from like, oh yeah, here's my repair receipt. This is how much it costs. Okay, now they have a dot matrix printer and it can look like a more official receipt, or they can, Photoshop something. And if you're really out to just not have any ethics at all, that could be a problem. And deepfake generators might make that harder. And you're in the cat and mouse game. Oh, well, with these deepfake generators, here's a deepfake detector. And the deepfake detector can, and then, they're going to fudge it. And I think because it's almost like dealing with any industry that has issues at the margins, Walmart or somebody is thinking about shoplifting, how much do they consider it structurally a cost of doing business that they can dial up an enforcement that will alienate some customers, it will carry other risks with it, but it will maybe dial down, and they just try to find where to set that dial. And that might happen with deepfakes too, if used in like that kind of malicious ways. And again, I think if it became common enough, there would then be a marketplace in detecting it. Or if I've got a claim above a certain amount, download this app to your iPhone to take the picture, not to use the iPhone cam. This picture will have an embedded watermark throughout the pixels that if you use some online thing to, insert another picture of mold here, it will stand out like, CSI kind of thing. And those things could become then opportunities within the industry to work with the adjustment and claims process. But I would think the other question just has to do more broadly with incentives and mistakes, again, that could be emergent, not from people who are out to do wrong, but for people who were never told or incented to think that something was their responsibility to be helpful with or to notice something. And thinking through the systems more generally and where to accord responsibility within them, I think there's a lot to be studied there on that front, that is distinct from kind of the bad actor model of ethical stuff. There's just so much more of this at the moment that is ethically freighted than with jobs that maybe were a lot similar to their counterparts 50 years ago or 100 years ago, for which the ethical dimensions were worked through in a process that just hasn't happened yet here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know we're running out of time, Manju. Maybe we should open up to some questions from the audience.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Shivani, and thank you, Jonathan. I see one right here. Says, I'm going to read it, it's a little long. It says, regulation and policy are evolving so quickly. How can an insurance company or the industry stay on top of it all, especially considering the variances that might happen at the regional and the local level?
Well, the insurance industry, as a comparatively regulated industry within the US, has some sectoral maybe advantages and disadvantages. And anybody watching, deeply enmeshed within the industry will know whether it's like, is your friendly local insurance commission, is it like, it's just great, I can call them up, see what they're thinking, or is like, no, they're doing another rule and it doesn't make sense to me, I don't know why it makes sense to them, kind of thing. But there are avenues of regulation that exist. And of course, it's an industry that's inherently, actuarially speaking, kind of statistical and about managing risk.
It's all about data.
Yeah. Yes. So this is another kind of risk to manage. And I think it's fair to ask, well, how innovative do you want to be? If you're generally trying to think over a period of months and years rather than just tomorrow in your portfolio, maybe it's not as important to be at the front of the line experimenting with stuff than other industries. And I remember once asking a colleague who's an insurance law professor, I said, gosh, this form that I just filled out in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is so confusing. I'm surprised it hasn't improved. He said, trust me, there's a couple cases that form weathered that was like, this form works. We are never changing it again. And I don't know if that's certainly not like a, Palo Alto attitude, but there's a reason why the dial is set differently sectorally towards, innovation where. And if we're talking about not the underwriting process, but the claims management process, that might be something where you've got more flexibility.
There's also a litigation risk tolerance, right? Because if you buy a house in California, for example, you sign a stack of papers this thick, because every form you sign has had a lawsuit preceding,
Yeah.
which is what necessitated the form to occur in the first place.
Yeah.
And so, which leads to the next question. Since the insurance industry is so, obviously from an automotive perspective, particularly embedded in what AI will do or not do for that adoption and the expansion of that industry, how can insurance companies then participate in designing and being part of that AI governance process, as opposed to being on the outside waiting for things to happen decided by somebody else?
I think my advice to the industry and its constituents is make your mistakes early and often, and ideally in a sandbox, in an environment that is the kind of environment that national security folks use when they do their wargaming, because they don't want to actually do a war to do their wargaming. And there are ways to really try, this is through human means, not through AI, to simulate the environment and invite people in, including perhaps some of the public advocates that are often seen as at odds with the industry, or with industries generally, and see what it would take to kind of red team some of these ideas, and to have as the baseline, we find it in all our interests. This is like a public interest exercise. And if we're helping people, that's earning money for us and helping the people we're helping. That, I think, would be the advice to the industry. Figure out ways to surface mistakes and vulnerabilities, including sort of structurally in what you're doing, early. And don't worry about getting called out for something that hasn't even happened or been deployed yet. You kind of just get your choices to, is it going to be sooner or later? And I think my advice to the regulatory side of things would be, think about how to incentivize that kind of forthcoming behavior. Could it be through the careful use of liability caps and immunities if a company should come forward with something it's thinking of doing, or maybe that it already did, but it's coming clean on it, and it's not even clear if it's against the law, but it wants to know because there's something that gives the spidey sense not a great feel. I even think in the tax realm, you can get these things called PLRs, private letter rulings, where under the right circumstances, you can write in the United States to the IRS and be like, so I was just thinking about doing this. Like, what do you think? And you get your personalized ruling before you take the plunge to see what it is. And then those PLR letters pile up. I think that's some creative work to be done on the regulatory side, because we don't fully know what we want. We can point to clearly bad things and disasters by bad actors if they, how to just close off those loopholes. But there's a whole middle zone of stuff that's just confusing and new and unclear. And the more we can ventilate that rather than concentrate it in pockets where it's really hard to kind of figure it out, the better.
I think that's great advice in terms of going out early, testing things, both good and bad, what's working, what's not, and doing it as a partnership across the companies that are trying to build these or use these types of technologies, and the regulators that are trying to make sure we have the right regulations in place to protect everyone at large. So great advice, Jonathan. I know we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we could have gone on for hours more. Unfortunately, our time was limited. But thank you so much again for joining us. And for the rest of you, looking forward to having you at our next session that we will be announcing shortly on LinkedIn Live. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Shivani.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.